Good evening. Yeah, there I am. Good evening. Welcome to Empower You. I'm glad to see so many of you here tonight on this momentous day celebrating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. I'm Betty Overstreet. I'm the executive director. Before we get started, Don Hurd is going to come up and lead us in the anthem and the pledge.
Please stand as you are able. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
We got a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to make this short and sweet. I hope all of you have been to at least one of our programs. If not, you'll have to come back next year and hear my speech that I make, or maybe next week. Anyway, Empower You is run strictly on donations, so we do pass around our little red buckets towards the end of a class. If you feel like you would like to contribute something towards what we do, we appreciate any amount that you would like to give. And also, I forgot to ask Dan. Dan, are you taking questions after class, after your talk?
Yes.
Okay. So if you have any questions tonight, if you would just please hold them until he's finished, and just raise your hand to let us know that you have a question. Wait for one of us to bring the microphone to you so that everyone here can hear as well as the people online can hear. And next, we have two more. Normally we're done by now, but because of these special events, we're going a little longer. So next week, next Wednesday, which is not our normal time for a class, so register that in your head. It's not Tuesday or Thursday, it's Wednesday. We're going to be having Reagan and the Brandenburg speech. I hope all of you can come to that. That's going to be a very good class. Matt Byrne, who's an attorney, is going to be presenting that class, and he's going to kind of cover what that speech meant at that time, and what it means to us today. And also Harold Ziegler, some of you here may know him, but he was in Berlin at that time. He lived on the other side, that's my understanding. So anyway, he's going to be here, and he's going to give you his perspective of what it was like during that time. So put that on your calendar, next Wednesday, 7 o'clock. And then we're having a class in August 18th or 19th, whatever Saturday it is. And that's going to be looking at Woodstock. How many of you here remember Woodstock? Ah, very good. I can't tell you a lot about Woodstock. I know about Woodstock, but I never took any interest in it. But I will tell you this, we are looking for a band for that night. We haven't found anybody yet. So if anybody here knows a band that might be willing to play whatever kind of music that was at that time, please let one of us know, because we do need to get somebody. And next I'm going to ask Dan to come up, and we're going to have our drawing. Everybody get a ticket? Okay. Last three numbers, 362.
Right
Here
here,
we go,
come on
from the
up.
back.
And this is for the 10-part series Band of Brothers. Congratulations. And this is a double thank you to one of our veterans. Thank you. We also have a second prize tonight.
Oh, we do. I didn't know that.
This is a book that was given to us by Ray to hand out tonight. It's called Omaha Beach on D-Day. We're going to be talking about it.
Number 418.
418.
Here we go.
Right here. You've won before. You can't win again. Oh, you won. Okay. Congratulations. Your name again? Thank you.
Before we proceed, I want to read a little information about Dan. Dan keeps a low profile. He doesn't like to talk about himself, but I like to talk about him. So I told him I was going to give a little bit of a bio of things I think most of you here may not know about him. He first became active in government in 2003 when he became involved fighting eminent domain and helping stop it in Evendale and in Norwood, Ohio. In 2006, he was one of the founders of WeDemandAVote.com, which successfully fought and stopped by ballot initiative a sales tax increase in Hamilton County, Ohio. Later, We Demand stopped red light cameras in Hamilton County. Dan spoke at the CPAC convention in 2008 to discuss major grassroots initiative actions across the United States. In 2010, he was one of 3 leaders of the initiative to end Ohio's estate tax, which happened in 2011. The Tax Foundation called the repeal of Ohio estate tax one of the most important tax accomplishments of 2011. In 2011, Dan founded EmpowerYouOhio.org, now in its 17th semester, a free university offered in the greater Cincinnati area with the goal of empowering citizens. Empower You has taught free classes to over 7,500 people in the greater Cincinnati area. In 2014, Dan was one of the leaders of the effort to separate Music Hall from a countywide state tax, which helped the Museum Center renovation get passed by the voters of Hamilton County. Dan is CEO of Frame USA here in Springdale. Dan's been working on this class for the last 6 months.
Forever.
And I know it's going to be really good because he goes in depth on everything and works real hard. So give Dan a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. So thanks to the voice of Empower You, Don Hurd, for his incredible music. As always, Don, thank you. Let's give Don a round of applause. I wanted to send a thank you to the team, my great team that's helped us with Empower You. It's just been an incredible semester this year. I think we've had 4 sellouts. We've had so many people come and join our classes. We are always looking for your ideas. If you've got one, please send us a note at info@empoweryouohio.org. But let me introduce you to the team. I've got Jill Google, who's our operations manager back there. Let's thank Jill. We've got popcorn maker, treasurer, security chief, Bill Roll. I think he's out front. We've got Jay Grunke, who's our producer in the back. Jay, he's got his job cut out for him tonight. And then we've got our great Betty Overstreet, our executive director. So I also wanted to thank everybody that's joining us on the virtual network tonight. It's been great seeing so many of you join, and it's great to see so many people up in the balcony. Just wave every now and then, and thanks for coming. So one thing before we get started, every class we pass the bucket because we're just a bootstrap organization. We don't really have any money, so we just try to keep our head afloat. But I've got a guy who works for me, and hopefully this will work. If it doesn't, I'm going to be in trouble. The best laid plans, right? See if I can get this started. Maybe it'll work then. Well, we've got a gentleman who works with me that lives in Dayton. He's the supervisor in one of our areas of our company, and I guess it was just, what, 9 or 10 days ago, Dayton got rocked by all those incredible tornadoes. He's been talking to me about it every day, because every day after work he goes and works there for 4 or 5 hours trying to help people. I had some great pictures, some incredible pictures to show you. If I get my PowerPoint working, I will. But tonight's red bucket, when we pass it, all the money that we collect will be going to the relief fund in Dayton. I just encourage you to think about adding a buck in there. The devastation up there is incredible. So thank you in advance. That'll happen later. And so yeah, I have been working on this D-Day presentation for 6 months. I like to do classes about things that I don't understand very well. And this is one I just thought this would be such a cool class to do. I haven't been to Normandy. There are a lot of you that have been. Betty just got back from Normandy, and Betty's agreed that if I'm struggling, she's going to come up and take over the class. So cheer her on if she does. But to be honest with you, I've been working on it 6 months. It's kind of overwhelming. And as I've kind of listened to all the personal stories this week on all the news channels, on every TV channel, there have been personal stories that have been so touching and great. What I hope to do tonight is put those personal stories kind of in perspective and try to tell the whole story of what happened kind of leading up to D-Day. And so that's what we're going to get going. Now we're going to take questions as I have time. I've got a lot of stuff I want to get through, so let's just see how it goes. We may take a break about halfway. If you start to fall asleep, fine. If you need to use the restroom, just go straight out. Anybody can get up, you can get a drink, you can do whatever you need to do. Just make yourselves totally at home. So I would love to get my little clicker going here. Let me just try one more time, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, good. So this is what's going on up in Dayton. It's incredible what happened there. Hard to even imagine. So as I said, any monies collected tonight will go straight to that. I hope you will consider doing that. So let's go ahead. Let's just dive in. I'm going to tell you the story of D-Day. D-Day was conducted to preserve freedom and to protect the systems of self-government in the world. That was said by Dwight David Eisenhower, who became president later, and is such a key personality in D-Day. We'll talk a lot about him. We're going to look through his eyes at some of the things that happened. So the goals of the class tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the strategy and tactics of Operation Overlord. That was the code name for the Allies' invasion of German-occupied France. We'll discuss all aspects and strategy of the invasion to give you an idea of what happened. We're going to specifically focus on Omaha Beach. That's probably the most talked about part of D-Day because so many things went wrong that day. And I think you'll find that really interesting. We'll also follow Operation Overlord as it pushes through France. This class primarily will focus on the time December 43 through December 1944. So let's talk about the dark days of early 1940. Hard for somebody like me to remember how bad things really were. But in May 1940, what had happened the year before is Poland had been taken over by Germany. And that was the start of a number of countries that just started escalating towards Nazism. I'll show you a picture soon of that. And President Roosevelt, who's another key character in this whole thing, declared a national emergency and ordered the Navy into the Atlantic, saying that we were going to stay neutral. Despite this neutrality, the British began a series of unofficial, unrecognized, critical discussions between January and March of 1941. The number one decision reached was that Germany would be the enemy of any future Anglo-American partnership. Roosevelt concluded that American energies should be focused in support of the British, and Germany invaded in France on May 10th, 1940. During this time, Germany also took over Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands. In the spring and summer of 1941, the US began selling war material to Britain, which they really needed. The Army started a limited expansion. I think everybody thought something was coming. Let's talk about President Roosevelt, a key figure in the D-Day preparations. He was the 32nd president of the United States. He was a member of the Democratic Party. He won 4 presidential elections. Okay, who's my Constitution person out there? What amendment limited presidents to 2 elections? Who can tell me? The 22nd, thank you. He directed the government during most of the Great Depression, and he built the New Deal coalition. His most famous speech, which you probably all heard him talk about, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself," happened at his first inauguration in 1933. He was generally considered by scholars as one of the 3 best presidents behind Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt. He was fundamental to the whole decision-making process of Operation Overlord. He was an incredibly steady hand. Roosevelt commissioned a victory plan in the early 40s, and he asked George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, to look at what a plan would take if we were called into war. If the defeat of Germany was the objective, then the mission was to attack the heart of German power as early and forceful as possible. He brought in this gentleman right here, who was Wiedemeyer, and he asked Wiedemeyer to look at different planning aspects. Together, they put together a plan of how they could strike Europe if they needed to. Marshall, the very first thing he looked at was an invasion that the British attempted in 1942. In 1942, the British attempted an invasion of Dieppe, which is right here. And the Dieppe raid, let me see here, just a sec. The raid by the British, the intention wasn't to hold the beachhead, it was just a test run. Could they pull off invading the beaches? Also, they wanted to try a new piece of equipment called the LCT, the Landing Craft Tank, to see if tanks could actually go on the beach. The August 19th landings, which were done by the Canadians, were just a huge failure. Just the worst that could possibly happen. German resistance was fierce. Within 9 hours, British commanders were forced to withdraw. 1,000 soldiers died, 2,000 soldiers were prisoners. Out of the 6,086 men that invaded Dieppe, almost 3,000 of them were 3623 were either killed or wounded or captured. It was a tremendous failure by the British. But what happened was Marshall learned a lot of lessons from Dieppe. A large bombardment force was essential to crack the prepared defenses. Bombs hadn't struck before. It must be backed up by a strong navy, which when D-Day happened, we had. An overwhelming force was essential if there was to be any hope of success. A series of meetings started to take place where leaders met to talk about what was happening. In 1941, on December 22nd, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their chiefs of staff met at the Eureka Conference. They endorsed, most important, the defeat of the Germans first. Now remember, Pearl Harbor had happened just a few days before. But still, they agreed Germany was going to be first, then the Japanese. They further agreed to try to wear down the axis around those nations. Both Britain and America agreed that the ultimate attack on Germany would take place in northwestern Europe. This decision was, in my mind, after really looking at it a long time, one of the very key things that happened that set up D-Day. It was the Eureka Conference that took place in Persia, Iran, in December 1943. Joseph Stalin, see if I can get you my map here. When I saw this map just a few days ago, I couldn't believe it. I was shocked because I didn't remember the Nazis had so much territory. It looks like they own Europe. So they got Stalin to come to this conference because Stalin was getting drilled over here in Russia. He was fighting him, And Stalin, who was just a tough guy, all of a sudden he decided to become a team player because he wanted action over here to take away some of the strength over there. So Stalin was there. He had only met Churchill once. He came. He pressed for the Western Allies to open a second front to take some of the pressure off him. Stalin pressed Churchill and Roosevelt to name a supreme commander of forces. Stalin believed that if there was no supreme commander, then the second front would not be victorious. At this conference, Eisenhower is appointed the supreme commander of the invasion. And here's Roosevelt's note from the President of the United States: the immediate appointment of General Eisenhower to command the Overlord operation has thus been decided upon. This is what the world looked like in 1943 and 1944. If I want to challenge you to think about one thing tonight, the question I want to challenge you with is, if this wouldn't have worked, what would this look like today? It's scary. Winston Churchill, born in 1874, died in 1965. Prime Minister, led the Conservative Party from 51 to 55, rose to politics during World War I. He kind of was known for erratic judgments for his decisions. At one point, after Eisenhower had been named Supreme Commander, he went to Eisenhower and he said, I'm going over there on D-Day. And Eisenhower and Roosevelt were just appalled. And Roosevelt got on the phone to the king and said, "You got to get this guy. This guy can't be over there on the beaches." And Churchill had said, "Well, I'm going to go as just a soldier. You can't stop me from doing that." So the king met with Churchill, and the king said, "Winston, if you're going, I'm going." And that stopped it pretty doggone quick. Actually, in World War II, he's credited really for shaping the strategy of the war, even though he was erratic. He's also known for the famous Dunkirk event where 336,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated and saved by 850 private boats. How many of you have seen that movie? It's pretty cool. I'm going to show you just a quick clip of Churchill's warning to the Allies.
1944 will see the greatest 1954 will see by the British and American armies. By the British battles far larger and more costly than Waterloo or Gettysburg will be fought. Waterloo or Gettysburg. Sorrow will come to many homes in the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom throughout the great republic. And throughout British and American manhood, striving in generous emulation, true brothers in arms will attack and grapple with the deadly foe. And grapple with the deadly foe.
Joseph Stalin. So we had Roosevelt, we had Churchill, we had Stalin, really the three key decision makers on what was going to happen. Born in 1878, died in 1953, a revolutionary and politician. He led the Soviet Union from 1920 to 1953. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union was transformed from a peasant society into a military superpower. The guy ruled with terror. He collectivized farming. He executed people. After World War II, he engaged in a tense relationship with the West. But what I want to tell you is his role in the decisions that led up to D-Day were very, very important. The first appointment, so the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight David Eisenhower, born in 1890, in the Army since 1911. This was something that just really surprised me. So I think it was, who's got your math there? Is that 31 years? Trying to do that on the fly. No, 20, oh, well, until 1944, 33 years, I had never seen combat. His job description, and I don't know if any of you had a chance to hear me talk with Brian yesterday about it, but for you business guys, this to me would be the best job description in the world because it's so simple. It's so straightforward. This was Ike's job description. You have complete control over all Allied forces regardless of nationality. It can't be much easier than that, can it? He was the boss. Ike's title was Commander of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, also known as Chef. Eisenhower was named because of the greater contribution percentage-wise to the Allied forces. Eisenhower's motto, and I could see this motto throughout everything that happened in D-Day: under my command, we will never stop training. When I read this, the thing that just hit me when I kept seeing it over and over again was, I've got to do more training, because the results showed. People were they had been so thoroughly trained on everything they were going to do. It was incredible. His training mantra would later reap dividends in Project Overlord. A second key appointment, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan of the British Army, entitled Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander. This guy's probably not a guy that's as familiar to you as some of the other people. He was the guiding principle of this appointment would be a full-scale invasion in the spring of '44. The Brits and Americans disagreed upon the timing. They finally agreed with a statement that a full-scale assault against the continent in '44 as early as possible. Morgan was commissioned to ask two questions. Would an Allied invasion have a reasonable chance of success? If so, could troops and supplies be built up to launch a grand offensive to defeat the German army? The next appointment that was critical, General Sir Bernard Montgomery. People in the United States wanted to get rid of him from the beginning. Nobody liked him. He had just an outgoing personality, but he acted as ground forces commander directing the battle for Eisenhower. He was controversial. His appointment bolstered the will of skeptics who believed that the invasion would likely fail. But Monty was a winner. He was involved in drawing up the plans for Operation Overlord during March and July of 1943. His mantra was, master plans have to be drawn. Everything's got to be fought according to a plan. And the planning you will see in this operation was incredibly complicated and together. A fourth key, General Leonard T. Guerrero, commanding general of the American ground force that assaulted Omaha Beach, a two-star general. He was 56 years old, considered old for an active combat assignment. In my opinion, unselfishness is the most important quality of an officer, be it a staff officer or commander. Guerrero knew that an amphibious assault against enemy defenses was hard. He had seen several failures. He had seen the failure in Dieppe, but he knew the terrain better than anybody. He said, our whole success will depend upon the speed of which commanders can get their orders to subordinates, the communication. So the team was in place: Eisenhower, Morgan, Montgomery, Guerrero. The buildup to D-Day was called Operation Bolero. American war production tripled. It increased over fourfold in 1942, fourfold again in 1943. US was outproducing Germany by 4-1 in tanks. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant was producing 500 B-24 Liberators per month. Could you imagine producing 500 airplanes in a month? What would we be able to do today? You know, Boeing's making one plane every, who knows how long. Americans supplied Britain with about a quarter of all their weapons. Britain had no money. We had to give it to them on credit. We called it lend-lease. We just said, here's stuff. The stakes were high. We were looking at this over in Europe. Britain supplied Americans with specialized weaponry and provided barracks, airfields, and training grounds. Britain was super organized for war. Over half of the entire working population was either in uniform or in civilian war employment. Strict rationing existed in Britain, which arrival of American troops meant a sudden increase in prices and a shortage of alcohol. The Overlord Secret was of the utmost importance. Today, if we were going to do it today, it would be on WikiLeaks the next day. But the way we kept this secret was, it's hard to imagine we were able to do it. nothing could really stop Britain. I mean, could stop Germany from knowing that there were a lot of troops in Britain. Nothing could stop that. But for instance, in 1 month in 1943, 4 new American divisions, 60,000 people arrived in England. I always kind of have trouble with these wordings, probably because I wasn't in the military, but 1 division is usually about 15,000 combat troops. And usually there's about 8,000 support elements that go along with it. A brigade is 3 or more battalions of about 1,500 to 3,500. A regiment, 2 or more, 1,000 to 2,000. Operation Bolero was succeeding. A lot of men, a lot of supplies, a lot of equipment were heading across the Atlantic. By June 1944, when D-Day hit, Allied forces assembled for D-Day were 1.7 million people, of which 1.4 million were British, 285,000 were American. The Canadians provided about 44,000 troops. Armaments, we had 1,300 warships, 1,600 merchant ships, 4,000 landing ships, and 13,000 aircraft. Assembling the troops was big, it was huge. Britain provided 3 armored divisions, Canadians 1 armored division, Poles provided 1 armored division and a parachute brigade, Americans provided 6 armored divisions. So, Montgomery had started to work hard on his plan. His plan said that Americans would take the westernmost beaches, codenamed Utah and Omaha. British and Canadians would take the eastern beaches, codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. Let's see if I can show you a picture of that. So, this is where everybody was today that you probably saw on TV, right? Portsmouth. You've got 120 miles between here and here. Here's Utah, here's Omaha, here's Gold, here's Juno, here's Sword. And this shows you the different paths that different groups were taking to get there. Everything had to be ready by Y-Day, Ready Day, a date decided by Eisenhower. To overcome enemy strong points, the Allies would need to get tanks and artillery on shore past beach defenses. The situation in France was complicated. De Gaulle, the leader of France, he claimed the right to assume the government. The French surrendered to Germany in June 1940. The Americans and British didn't want to have anything to do with de Gaulle. That's de Gaulle right there. And that insulted de Gaulle a lot. One of the advantages that the Americans had was the Enigma advantage. The most carefully guarded intelligence secret during the war was the ultra secret, which played a major part in providing the Allies with what Normandy really looked like. Before the war, the Germans had started encoding radio signals in a typewriter-type device. We had mathematicians that were able to crack that. This happened in 1942 to 1944, another great movie you might want to see. And so we did have a lot of intel on what things look like. Security was vital, impossible to achieve. If the Germans could establish the date and location, we'd be in trouble. A new level of security called Bigot, which was higher than top secret was invented. Many, many officers were sent home for telling people about what was going to happen. 10 Bigot officers were lost in a German E-boat attack on a training exercise. They actually sent divers to search the seabed to make sure that all their corpses were discovered. That's how tight things were. A major scare developed when a package burst at a mail sorting facility in Chicago, which revealed a set of Operation Overlord Plans. The plans that were later opened, the orders that were opened by the soldiers that were going to execute D-Day were 700 pages long. One of the most interesting parts of deception that we tried to fool the Germans was called the Pas de Calais deception. So this is Cherbourg. This becomes really important. This is Caen. This will become really important later. You've got Normandy, and up here you've got Calais. Now, our #1 goal was to try to make the Germans think that instead of attacking here, that we were going to attack there. And so what we did was, there was this guy named Saleh Zuckerman. He devised a clear plan of attacks that would isolate Normandy and give people the idea that Pas-de-Calais was the area. Yes? Okay. The deceptions were almost complete. We sent all sorts of signals. The Germans thought, Hitler thought, Pas-de-Calais was the invasion area. So we did all sorts of things to try to throw them off. The object was to fool them into thinking Pas-de-Calais was the area. On the night before D-Day, we flew patrols over the Pas-de-Calais area, making them think that was the area. We threw out chaff in order to deceive enemy radar into thinking that's where we were going. On the day of D-Day, at the very end of June 5th, the Germans did get an intercept, a message saying that we were landing in Normandy. But the message was not passed on to Rommel because Rommel had decided, amazingly, to go home and visit his wife for her birthday. What a stroke of luck for us. So even though the Germans received the message, nobody knew. Here, Eisenhower talks about, for a minute about the Pas-de-Calais deception.
Well, now, in the selection of Normandy as opposed to the Pas-de-Calais area where the crossing was much shorter and so forth, was the surprise element of Normandy the principal factor in making that decision?
Well, yes, that was one. Now, although strangely enough, Hitler, with all his intuition, did have one good guess. But he never thought it was good enough that he would order the main defense to be made in Normandy. We knew, of course, you could not keep the Germans from knowing that great things were afoot. We had to try to surprise him on location and timing. And then timing, not only the general timing, but if possible, in the time of day. In any way that you could would surprise him, that was also our benefit. Timing.
How do you think we succeeded so well in keeping the secret of the location and the day?
Time of day. Well, of course, extreme measures were taken. When we started to move the troops south to get to their embarkation places, we just pinned them up, and we wouldn't let them out. There was no running around in the villages around. When we started to move the people down in these cages, you might say, they couldn't call them anything else because they were fenced in. They were crowded up, and everybody was unhappy, and worse than this. We went so far that we stopped all diplomatic exchanges from the embassies of the world with London, and this was embarrassing to their government, but they were sturdy. They stuck right by it. We did everything to keep any information going out, and on top of that, we did a lot to confuse the enemy. We put phantom armies, and we put radios and things with phantom messages going back and forth all the time between an army group commander and his new outfits. Well, to show you how we succeeded, Mr. Speidel, or General Speidel of the German Army, who was the chief of staff to Rommel, in writing his book 5 years later, he said, we wondered why the Allies didn't use very quickly their 75 divisions. We didn't have 75 divisions. We had about, I think it was 35 in all England, all Britain, including the Canadian, the British, and one Polish, and I think a French, and all of our own. And in more than that, the Germans kept those horses back in the Pas-de-Calais. They kept all those divisions when we were fighting in Normandy because they still believed the main attack was coming over Pas-de-Calais. Back in the Pas-de-Calais, they kept all those divisions when we were fighting in Normandy because they still believed the main attack was coming over Pas-de-Calais.
Our intelligence told us, or so we thought, that the Germans only had 1,000 men guarding the 4-mile beach at Omaha. Even more encouraging was Guerrero, who you saw earlier. He found that at least 40% of the division was inferior German soldiers, mostly Poles, who supposedly weren't enthusiastic about risking their lives for the Third Reich. For D-Day alone, Guerrero planned for a force of over 10,000 infantrymen to land on Omaha Beach. Guerrero said, adaptable armies win wars. Before D-Day, we had the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group. They were a secret photographic mission. They went and photographed the mission, and they took something called a Merton oblique photograph. The goal was when sunrise hit, that those photos would allow the men to recognize all the natural man-made landmarks of their landing areas. Germans faced a big disadvantage. They were operating out of a foreign country. They were unable to create a partnership with France or Britain or Dutch, the areas they'd taken. It was estimated that 10% of their population might resist. They had major problems with the railroads in France. They needed the railroads to move supplies west. Thousands of Germany's supply trains were stuck in Belgium and unable to proceed westward. Logistics would become so important to D-Day. Germans also believed that the window would be very tight for an invasion. They looked at the tide charts. They thought that June 5th to 7th would present favorable conditions. Hitler wasn't totally sure on the Pas-de-Calais area over there, and he was forced to maintain a presence on the entire coastline. He also had to defend the Eastern Front against the Russian army. He also had problems in Yugoslavia and Greece. All of these demands just weighed on Hitler. He had a lot of problems. So what about Hitler? He came to believe that the struggle against the Red Army in Russia was no longer decisive to winning the war. He believed that the Allies would represent a golden opportunity for his Third Reich, which he felt would live for 1,000 years. If they could defeat the British and Americans, the Allies would be incapable, for psychological reasons, of mounting another invasion. So Hitler thought, well, Russia's important, I'm going to put some people there, but if I can defeat this invasion that's coming, if I can just set them back, send them off the beaches, that could be the whole key to me winning everything. The amount of time and effort that Hitler put towards solidifying this entire coastline was amazing. He installed over 500,000 obstacles on the beaches that would try to stop our boats from landing. Hitler felt with a decisive victory against the West, he could concentrate his forces in the East and crush the Soviets. Hitler was quoted as saying, Germany's primary take for 1944 is a defeat upon the Allies in the West. Hitler considered the Americans timid. He felt we missed opportunities. He felt we weren't smart, we weren't clever. The Germans were well aware that Overlord began the British and were at maximum strength. Hitler knew Montgomery would try and have to win with brains and keep his risk to a minimum. Hitler knew that more American units were available to fight if things got tough. So he had a coastline here of about 3,000 miles that he had to defend. He completed 12,247 fortifications. Some of those were down on the Mediterranean coast, which I can't show you. He built 5,000 beach obstacles. He laid 6.5 million mines. Can you believe that? 6.5 million mines. How would you like to be on a boat headed there with 6.5 million mines out in the English Channel right there? He installed Erwin Rommel as the principal defender. Rommel had made every possible effort to turn the coast into a fearful obstacle. Rommel was focused on Pas-de-Calais, and the Germans' greatest resources were there. Who's this guy? Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, known for his leadership of Germany. He built the Atlantic Wall, which is what they called their defenses all along Normandy. He was known for the term blitzkrieg, which is a military tactic to create disorganization. He was highly decorated in World War I. Rommel supported Hitler in the Nazi seizure of power. He had made every possible effort to turn the coast into a fearful obstacle. Rommel was obsessed with the idea that the key to defensive success rested in obstructing and mining the entire coast of northern France and Belgium. Rommel didn't get the time he needed. By June 6, 1944, less than half of his beach obstacles had been installed. Many of Rommel's men were second-rate soldiers, and he reasoned that first-class coastal fortifications could compensate for human deficiencies. These were the obstacles, the 500,000 obstacles that Rommel constructed along the 3,000 miles of the French coastline. These are mines placed on rafts that floated in the water, barriers placed along the beach with mines on them to deter tank and water landings. You can see these beach obstacles up here that were meant to stop boats from coming on shore. Building these barriers had greatly compromised the Nazi army and Rommel. They had to use a lot of foreign workers. Fuel was in short supply. In many cases, the Germans, it's hard to imagine, but in their own country, they had no transportation. Everything had been sent to Russia. It had been sent west. They were using horses to get around in Germany. 50% of the German troops were under 20 years old. Hitler's Navy was almost non-existent. He had 34 motor gunboats, 163 mine hunters, 34 U-boats. The only effective weapon that he really had was the obstacles, the 6.5 million mines, and some fighters that were pretty good. Despite that, Hitler and Rommel thought they could win. They thought they could win and stop the whole thing. So, the day of the invasion, could the Allies achieve a surprise? At one moment, they almost blew it. Original plans called for D-Day to be June 5th. Bad weather changed it. Eisenhower had to postpone D-Day on June 5th, and one convoy of troops, let me see here. One convoy of 135 boats didn't receive the order and headed to Normandy. They didn't get the order to turn around until they were 25 miles away. The whole thing almost collapsed in front of our very eyes. The German security force had reported the Allies had gone to the highest state of alert, but the Allies succeeded in achieving almost a complete tactical surprise. Here Eisenhower talks about how D-Day, how the day was chosen.
Well, there was first of all, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the two governments, the Western governments, had told General Stalin that we would attack in May. So we began to examine the weather, and we had to have a particular combination of tides, light, and moon. And this was showed that you had about a few days in June where you could have the perfect conditions, or nearly perfect conditions, and a few days in May. We'd like to have gone on the 5th of May. But to get the breadth of attack we thought necessary, we had to wait until June. Now, the ideal days were from June 4th. 5th was the ideal day, but 4th was satisfactory. 5th, 6th were from, and 7th, and even possibly 8th. But that would have been stretching a little bit. Now, I picked July 5th. June 5th is the best. But that would have been. And we came down here, hoping and praying that the weather would be sufficiently good we could go on June 5th.
Well, General Eisenhower, June 4th was the day when you had to make the decision to go on June the 5th.
That is correct.
What happened on that day, June 4th?
Early on the morning of June 4th, I came from my camp about a mile from here, came into this room.
What happened on
And Captain Stagg, who was the chief meteorologist for the Allied forces, he was supported by 2 or 3 Americans, a couple other British. But he made the presentation. That morning, the stars were out, it looked beautiful, and he gave us the worst report you ever saw. And he talked about gales hitting the Normandy beaches, and winds up to the rate of 45 miles an hour, that kind of thing. Landing would be impossible. So I just said, all right, we have to postpone. So we postponed for 24 hours.
There wasn't any question of going the 5th. I mean, none of your commanders said advised going.
I believe Montgomery said he was ready to go.
Question of going the 5th. None of your commanders said
it didn't. The conditions were such that I knew. We'd had our troubles down in the Casablanca beach when you got surf pretty high. We also had some in Sicily. So it was it wasn't in the cards. You couldn't go. We also had
so you stood down on the 4th.
And that was the weather when we did that looked so lovely. But in the morning of the 5th, Walter,
So you
here's the big thing.
on the 4th. So
Morning of the 5th, I came over here. The weather was terrible. This house was shaking. Here's the big thing. Now, morning of 5th, I came you know, this, you said, well, there's no use almost of looking at this thing again, but there's this one thing about it. You know, it certainly increased my confidence in Captain Stagg and his crowd, because 24 hours earlier, when it looked so bad, so nice, they said, this is what you're going to have, and we had it. Oh, it was really. 24 hours earlier, when it looked so bad, so nice, they said, this is what you're going to have, and we had it. Oh, it was really.
For those of you weathermen haters, it's interesting. So what about the naval aspect of this whole invasion? Eisenhower originally planned Project Neptune, which is the naval aspect, as he was concerned that we lacked enough amphibious vessels and bombardment ships to carry out Neptune. The Royal Navy took drastic steps to build more boats. But when D-Day began on June 6th, there were 5,300 naval vessels, compared to almost none for the Germans. Eisenhower still didn't think we had enough, but we had a lot of them. So the journey is 120 miles. Everybody was worried about the German mine belts. On June 6th, the Royal Navy had 3,261 ships. We had 865. There were 49 French, Poles, Greeks, Dutch, and Norwegian ships. The US forces were worried that the British had been highly successful with amphibious missions, which are the most complex of all military operations, that they had not been successful. Training was rigorous, maintenance was at the top of its importance. The best chance the Germans had to defeat the invasion was sea mines. Yet the 5-mile mine belt that the Allies had worried about almost turned out to be empty. The 6.5 million mines weren't there. Allied minesweepers detected and neutralized only 29 mines throughout that mine barrier. This is interesting. Hitler had developed in 1943 an unsweepable mine, one we couldn't stop, but he hadn't been able to get them to Normandy. Thank goodness. This is kind of interesting how a minesweeper works. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I didn't really understand. You've got a boat here, a boat here. They're holding a wire under here to bring a mine up, pop it to the top, and then shoot it. That's what the goal was. Keys to Project Neptune: select the day and time when weather and tides were best. To increase the chances of surprise, Army leaders wanted to land at night. However, naval officers said it's got to be during the day to make sure that the gunfire support will work. Also, Allied underwater miners needed light to clear lanes to the beach. Allied planners wanted the assault to begin 3 to 4 hours before high tide and to be preceded by a moonlit night. The plan: Allied forces had to seize the beachhead. The attack would be preceded by bombing, which may last up to 6 hours. Then they needed to break into the interior of France. They hoped to, this area right here, Cherbourg, was super important. Logistics were key to this whole thing. They had to get supplies. They had to get 720,000 tons of supplies into France every month, 720,000 tons, just to support all these people that were going to be there. If they didn't have ports, they couldn't do that. On May 25th, 1944, that puts us at 11 days before D-Day. Commanders were given their orders, 700 pages long and 3 inches thick, saying, execute Project Neptune. This is, you heard me talk about Eisenhower said training was so important. Montgomery said planning was everything. You talk about planned out. This is what the plan looked like. Could you imagine somebody drawing every single division, every single boat, every single command, and who was going to go where to the 5 beaches? This is the first time you've seen the 5 beaches. Utah and Omaha were invaded by Americans. Gold was British. Juno was Canadian, and Sword was by the British. An extra bonanza, one little extra thing that helped us. We intercepted a series of transmissions from Tokyo. This guy, General Oshima, had been sent to inspect Rommel's Atlantic Wall to tell us to tell them where it was weak. And at the last minute, we were able to intercept that. We now knew where their weaknesses were. At least we thought we did. To get ready, April 1st, the coastal ban on all visitors. On May 23rd, Eisenhower sets D-Day for June 5th. May 25th, Neptune orders are entered. May 28th, the date of D-Day and the 14 hours for the beach are announced to commanders. May 31st, this is the most amazing thing. 6 days before D-Day, all the men were put in their boats and told to sit there for 6 days. Could you imagine sitting in a boat for 6 days? Could you imagine what it would be like? It's hard to even imagine. On June 1st, Admiral Bertram Ramsay assumed command of the invasion fleet. June 2nd and 3rd, the weather worsens. June 4th, the invasion fleet begins to get underway. The signal is sent to postpone. June 5th, it is postponed. This is what the ships looked like that day. This is what it looked like. Could you imagine being there? This is what one of the vehicles looked like, called the LCT. The first waves of the landing force's objectives were to deliver and release into the water 32 LCT landing craft tanks, which were designed to land tanks on the beaches. These armored vehicles were intended to provide infantry with direct fire support. In addition to troops on D-Day, the Eastern Task Force put on the beach I should just say a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. We had 133,000 soldiers ready to go on Normandy. The Allies felt it was crucial to create a large enough beachhead to permit the rapid buildup of forces. Everything that we were trying to do was to land the people here, break into France so that we could go towards Germany and stop the mess with Hitler. Hitler's paranoia. Hitler got so paranoid about Rommel taking command away from him. He was worried, and so what he did, which probably hurt the Germans, thank goodness, was that he decided that Rommel had become too powerful. And so he transferred some of the power to Gerd von Rundstedt, another field marshal in the Nazi army. This power split created all sorts of petty jealousies between Rommel and von Rundstedt. Hitler saw the major threat of the Allies to Cherbourg, this really important port, which is on the Khotan Peninsula. Rommel did too. Rommel was constantly traveling this area. Rommel installed these Rommel-Sparger poles that look like this. Just poles up in the air. They were part of his 5,000 beach obstacles. These would hopefully stop gliders from landing. They were everywhere. Planners hoped to use the ports of Cherbourg, Lorient, and Brest a month after invasion to send supplies. Infantry divisions, I was wrong, 780,000 tons of supplies were required every month. The concept of supplying the troops logistically was just of the most paramount questions. Who would do it better? Would the Germans be able to get their supplies west to their troops, or would the Allies? During the spring of 1944, Spitfires, Mosquitoes, Mustangs, and Lightnings flew for many hundreds of sorties. A total of 72 specific objectives were singled out for attack. Black and white stripes were painted over all the aircraft as we prepared for D-Day. Germany, on the other hand, their Air Force was under the control of Hugo Sperry. Germany only had a total of about 890 aircraft. Of this figure, it was estimated only 497 were serviceable. much less than our 13,000 aircrafts that we were ready to supply. The number of Allied aircraft vastly made the Luftwaffe powerless. This is what some of the airplanes looked like. At D-Day, we had 8,000 aircraft ready. The German aircraft, they only had 486. We had a huge tactical advantage. So now we had a huge tactical advantage in the air. We had a huge tactical advantage in the water. But what we didn't have a tactical advantage was that we had to land and get on the beach. Eisenhower talks for a minute about his final plans right before D-Day.
And I think that I just reviewed them in my mind and said I thought the best opportunity now. We were given sort of a God-given opportunity in this little space of good weather, of which the Germans knew nothing, it turned out later. And I said yes.
Now this was at approximately 4:15 in the morning of June the 5th. You had about 20 hours to wait before the first airborne troops went in, and 24 hours before, 26 hours before the ground forces hit the beach. What did you do during all those hours of waiting?
Well, of course, that's the most terrible time for the senior commander. He's done all that he can do, all the planning, and matter of fact, there's very little more that any commander below, above division command can do anything after once you get started. So, the first thing I did, I went over and fortified myself with a lot of coffee and breakfast. Then I began to go up and down the wharves. Some of the ships were still starting out, and I saw people that had sent them off and so on. And I came up here during the middle of the day to see if any news coming out, and I kept pretty close to my communication center. And then finally, along about 6 in the evening, I went over to a field from which the airborne, the American, started out. Now, I couldn't go to all these fields because there were many of them. But I did go into the 101st Division, and it was a very fine experience. They were getting ready and all camouflaged and their faces blackened and all this. And there they saw me, and of course they'd recognize me. They said, "Now quit worrying, General. We'll take care of this thing for you."
Quit worrying, General. We'll take care of this thing for you. This is South Wick House. This is where all the decisions took place in Portsmouth, which is right there where everybody was today. This was a board that was in South Wick House. This shows almost the same lanes that you saw on one of the earlier maps that they had drawn, that they had laid out who was going to go where. Everything was set for D-Day, H hour. So a few definitions. D-Day, the Allied invasion. H hour, the exact time the assault forces would storm ashore Normandy. Eisenhower specified that as 6:30. Operation Overlord, code word for the plan to invade Germany. Neptune, the amphibious invasion. Bolero, the movement of troops and logistics to get ready for it. This shows you between 1942 to 1944, the numbers are a little bit confusing, but it just shows you how much the buildup was to a point that there were about 1.5 million. Some people say 1.7 million. There are a lot of numbers that are complicated. And when you hear people talk about deaths and stuff like that, I've heard many mistakes this week. So just be careful about that. And this is the number of supplies and equipment that were ready for D-Day. So here's the schedule, 6:30.